My name is Mary Jane Andrews, and it is my pleasure as your President and CEO to introduce our panelists from the International Valuation Standards Council. Sir David was educated at Edinburgh University, and in 1972 qualified as a Scottish Chartered Accountant. In 1990, he moved from a role as National Technical Partner at KPMG to be the first full-time chair of the UK Accounting Standards Board. In 2001, Sir David was selected to be the first chair of the International Accounting Standards Board, where he led the board for over 10 years until his term ended in June 2011. And by the end of his term, over 120 countries, including Canada, had adopted the International Financial Reporting Standards. Our valuation profession is privileged to have Sir David serve as chair of the Board of the Trustees of the International Valuation Standards Council, a leadership role which he assumed in October 2012 and continues to serve today. CBVs currently play important roles on at least 4 of the IVSC's boards, committees, and forums. And I've had the opportunity personally to work with Sir David on several levels at the IVSC. And I know you will enjoy Sir David's remarks on the IVSC and its role in the global financial system. So please extend a warm Canadian welcome.
Can you all hear me? I'm always reluctant to ask that question after my lecturing days at Edinburgh University, when a voice from the back said yes, but I'm willing to change with anyone who can't. So here I am, an accountant, speaking to expert valuers, and why? Well, as I talk, you'll gather why. But basically, I'm an internationalist. I believe in globalization. I believe in the international community. And when I was with KPMG, you could actually point to global on a map. It was a big place with 50 states and sea on both sides. And you lost partnership points if you disputed that. But it's far more than that. And so is valuation. Valuation is so ingrained into the international economy that perhaps sometimes even valuers don't understand just how much. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the IVSC. Now, to some of you this will be a bit remote, but coming from Scotland, of course, I'm used to that. When I was at KPMG, I took 2 of my London partners up to the Hebrides. These are islands off the west coast of Scotland, to do an investigation. And being London partners, of course, they had to keep up to date. And went into the local newsagent and asked for a copy of the Financial Times, and was a bit taken aback when the old lady behind the counter said, "Will you be wanting today's or yesterday's?" But coming from London, they had to have today's. "Oh, well," she said, "you'll have to come back tomorrow." Well, IVSC really kicked off in the early 1980s, mainly dealing with real estate. 2008, it was completely overhauled, partly as a result of the financial crisis, where it was told to expand its horizons. Basically, when you look at what it has done since, financial instruments was a big issue, business valuations increased in importance, and so on. It's now over 100 members around the world. Its objectives are simple: global standard setting, protect the public interest, and to improve the credibility of the valuation profession. So that's translated into these objectives. One set of high-quality global standards. So it doesn't matter if you have a valuation here in Quebec or in Qatar or Queenstown or Quito, you're actually going to do it the same way. And that's where globalization comes in. If the Aussies do it the best way, why don't we just take their standard? Why don't we all do it that way? And that's really what this is all about. Can we get to the gold standard? We want IVSC to be referred to as the global standard setter for internationalization and valuation, and to add status to the valuation profession. And I'm going to speak a bit more about that. We want you to be identified as a world-class profession. You're at the tough end of accounting. Accountants sometimes think they can do this. They can't. They're not trained to. And yet it's critical, as I'll point out, to what they're actually doing. Where's valuation? It's everywhere. I don't have to show this slide to let you know the sort of things that you get involved in. You're just right throughout the economy, in all different areas. But why global? Obviously, I'm used to IFRS, and we set up exactly the same objective as I've just outlined that I would like to see for the valuation profession, one single set of global standards. So a high quality, transparent set that's used worldwide. When we started, there was only 5 countries used IFRS. 10 years later, over 120. Now it's about 135, and it's growing. All right, the US doesn't use it yet. It will. As Winston Churchill said, the Americans always do the right thing, but only after they've tried everything else first. And it'll come. They were shocked when Canada went to IFRS. They were shocked when Mexico went to IFRS. They're surrounded. South America's gone that way. Europe's use IFRS. Australasia uses IFRS. Japan's moving to IFRS. China's almost there. India's about to go. And US GAAP, shrivel on the vine. It'll be used a lot, obviously, in America. Other countries are rejecting it. IFRS isn't going to go away. So the idea is to provide the world's markets with an integrated accounting language. Do you know accounting in Latvia? Do you know it in India? You would if everybody used IFRS. And that's the reason it's spread. People want others to remove the accounting risk of not quite understanding the nuances of national accounting. Tim Geithner, the former Secretary of the Treasury in the US, he said, how on earth can we control banks and regulate them if everybody is doing something different with their accounting? We just can't understand it. And that's why it's so important to do this as well. And that's where valuation comes in too. Why global standards? Well, when you raise all your funding in your own country, then you set your own rules for accounting. How do they account for that? How do they value things? But now you don't do it that way. 20% of the companies on the New York Stock Exchange and the same number in London are foreign. They're going overseas for their funding. Investors want to spread their risks, and they go overseas to invest. And it's all starting to move about. And when you look at what happens, globalization is inconsistent with national standards. It gets in the way if you have that. And that's not to say there are issues about it, and people question things, and sometimes you get lots of questions. I remember when I went to see the Australian government as they switched to IFRS. I mean, they had plenty of questions, almost as many as the immigration officer at Sydney Airport, who was not an uncritical admirer of the Poms, and for some 15 minutes questioned me rather rudely, and then finally asked whether or not I had a criminal record, to which I replied I didn't realize I still needed one to get into Australia. Well, corporations are global, they consolidate, they want to use the same methods, and that's part of the issues, because there's always resistance to moving to one set of standards. And it's what I'd call the 3 C's. There's change. People don't like change. There's the cost of change, but the one that really matters, loss of control. You delegate, and that's why when it happens to move towards globalization, you must have a sort of partnership with national standard setters, with national institutes, and that's what we have here. We're here today in Quebec talking to the CEOs of the major professional organizations in the valuation world. And that's how we move together. We discuss issues. We want to know where they think we should go and what should happen. And what should these standards look like? Well, if you look at IFRS, it's about 2,500 words. If you look at US GAAP, it's 17,500. We're not going there. I believe firmly in professionalism and principle-based standards. It's not for us to tell you exact detail what to do. We should set out the principles. I've often said, if you want us to deal with 80% of an issue, we can do that in about a dozen pages. If you want us to deal with 95% of the issues, that's going to be about 300. That's not for us. We've got to stop getting down into the weeds. And it's never easy doing things internationally. You know, even if you look at Europe, in the UK, everything is permitted unless it's prohibited. In Germany, everything's prohibited unless it's permitted. In the Netherlands, everything's prohibited even if it is permitted. And in France, of course, everything's permitted, especially if it's prohibited. Well, I mentioned earlier valuations right at the center of things. People sometimes don't understand that. Financial stability and financial reporting depend heavily on valuation. The prudential regulators use the financial reports to make their minds up about how they're going to control stability. And let me tell you, they don't trust the numbers. They're concerned about the valuations. That's why we're looking at financial instruments. And so what do? They put in capital requirements. And if they're not sure, they increase them on the grounds that, well, if they're having to withhold this sort of money in the banks, then that will take care of any suspect valuations. And that matters a great deal. In the crisis, valuation was right at the center of the arguments. People were concerned about it. Christian Noyer, who was the governor of the Banque de France, he said at the time, uncertainty about the true value of complex financial instruments undermined global markets, raised uncertainty about counterparty risk positions, and led to contagion across classes, markets, and regions. And one of the problems was the level of equity held in banks. In the mid-19th century, 33% of the major banks' balance sheets was equity. By the end of the 19th century, it was 20%. 100 years later, 5%. And at the time of the financial crisis, 2%. You don't have to get valuations far wrong to lose 2%. And they lost it. At one time during the crisis, 1/4 of the world's GDP was propping up the major banks. And that shows you where the confidence and the nervousness about valuation lies. 6 weeks after Lehman's, we had this emergency meeting in Brussels. And each delegation, you'd get the deputy governor of the central bank, you'd get the securities regulator, and the senior official from the Treasury. I have never smelt such fear in a room as I did that day. All the markets were going south. You could see that they felt the capitalist system could collapse. And in the course of this and the discussions, Mario Draghi, who was the chairman at that time of the Financial Stability Board, turned to me and said, David, what are you accountants doing about valuation? And I said, nothing. That's not our expertise. We take the values. We don't create them. And he said, who's doing it? And I said, there's guys out there doing this stuff. And then we discovered there wasn't. And what do you do in a liquid market when nothing's moving? And we had to put together a working group from the ISB and the Financial Accounting Standards Board in the US, and in 3 weeks come up with an answer. What do you do in illiquid markets? Well, what you don't do is take fire sales. And that's what they were doing. And of course, that made the whole collapse even faster. And then that started to get me worried about who is doing this? Where are these numbers coming from? And as we found out later, the Basel Committee has shown in experiments with various banks, the differences in their valuations for the same instruments can be up to 140%. So where, as I said to Mark Carney, are your capital buffers then, if that's the range of variation? And that's where valuation comes right to the fore. Accountants don't like value. Neither do those who run organizations where value is actually dictating their performance and their financial position. They would rather control it by cost. You can sell things when you want to. You can profit manipulate that way. You can't if you have to use value. But we did use value, and they hated it, and especially in the crisis when it started going down. They love it when it's going up, but now it started to show the bad side of things. And I was interviewed by the BBC World Service shortly after that meeting I've just described, at the height of the crisis. And the interviewer said, in this crisis, fingers are pointing, and fingers are pointing at you. You're the man who caused this crisis. And I said, well, they're right. I made banks give up the risk management techniques. I made them give loans to people who had no income and no assets. I made them take these mortgages, break them in tiny bits, add them to bits from hundreds of other mortgages. I made them scatter them worldwide. I made the credit rating agencies give them AAA ratings. I made people buy them without any due diligence. It was all my fault. And there was a silence, and the interviewer said, for the benefit of overseas listeners, that was irony. But there was huge pressure to stop valuing for accounting. It's causing problems. So let's stop it. Let's go back to the good old safe cost. It was interesting, when I used to be a university lecturer, first year accounting, first day, I asked all those who'd been corrupted by accounting at school to leave, and I gave those who remained just a sheet of paper, 4 assets on it: cost, their expected life, their age, selling price, replacement price, and said, give me a statement of financial position. What do you think they used? 3/4 used selling price. That's the way people think. They don't think in terms of depreciated historical cost. Only 4% of the population thinks that way, and almost all of them have been trained by accountants. But that's not how people think. They don't think in terms of the value of their house, in terms of what they paid for it 20 years ago. They think of what they could get now. Derivatives. People are saying you must show those at cost. There isn't a cost. It's a contract. I could write all along that wall a number and say, let's swap that number of Canadian dollars for British pounds this time next year. The minute the exchange rate changes, one of us wins, one of us loses. And if we don't record that, someone's going to get an awful shock at the end when the contract unwinds. And that's why it has to be shown in financial reporting. But there's more than that, the way accounting's going. Real estate in Canada and the UK can be revalued in accounts, not in the United States. Investment properties have to be revalued every year. Intangibles, your area. I was the technical partner who put the first brand, or allowed it to go on, a British balance sheet. In 1987, Grand Metropolitan bought Smirnoff vodka. And in those days, Britain had a bizarre accounting policy. That would have been classed as goodwill, not an asset, goodwill. And that was written off against reserves. So 4 or 5 big acquisitions, you blew your net worth away. And people would criticize companies. And Grand Metropolitan was criticized. And they said, but it's an asset. You know, we get offers even more than the 10 million or whatever it was they paid for it. It should be on balance sheet. And I recognize that as an argument. The next question was, yes, but what do we do with it? Do we depreciate it? How long's the life of Smirnoff? Could be endless. And that's where the impairment test was born, because what we did was we asked Grand Metropolitan, how did you value this to pay for it? And it was discounted cash flows. And we said, okay, we're going to substitute the actual ones into your projections. And if that drops below 10 million or whatever the number was, we will write it down. And that's what you now use for the impairment tests in IFRS. But that's where it came from. Lots of issues. Extractive industries, another one. Reserves, they'll be valued before too long. What about homegrown intangibles? Grand Metropolitan were delighted when Smirnoff went on balance sheet, and they said, well, what about the ones we created, Bailey's Irish and all these others? We said, sorry, you didn't write a check for them. And when I was chairman of ISB, I made Mr. Murdoch take all his newspaper mastheads off his Australian papers out of his accounts. And why? We had no idea where the values came from. And in the standard it said, you can't show an internally generated intangible unless you can measure it reliably. That's a fault of accounting. They're assets. They're quite clearly assets. So there's the challenge for you. The accountants don't trust the values. You need to show how you can do it. You need to show the evidence of valuations being matched by sales shortly afterwards. And then accounting will open up. And far more intangibles will appear on the balance sheets. People are nervous about value. And that was the same. We had major fights with the French government. They hated value. Both Chirac and Sarkozy complained about using it in accounting very volubly. But when I finished, I can tell you that the atmosphere between myself and the French government was one of mutual trust and understanding. They didn't understand me, and I certainly didn't trust them. And at least now, when I go to Paris, I'm treated like a king, and you know how the French treat their kings. Well, agriculture, another area for valuation. Great efforts getting that into accounting. And yet, what use is cost in agriculture? What do you do in a cow as a calf? Do you divide the cost in two? Or do you estimate how many calves it's going to have and allocate the cost to that? Or do you just say, value it? That's what the farmer does. So why isn't accounting doing that sort of thing? Well, it is now, but it took a big fight to get there. Liabilities, litigation, decommissioning, all these things. I said earlier, you're at the tough end of accounting. Accountants hate these things. And while they think they might be able to do it, no, they can't. They're not experts. And that's where you come to the fore. And that's why I'm more than ever interested in valuation. And that's why I'm standing here today. I believe in it. I believe in globalization. I believe in valuation. And that's the way accounting is going to keep heading more and more in the future. One set of standards makes you an international profession. At the moment, you're national professions. I want you to be international and recognized as such. I want the fact that value is accepted and trusted to spread across the markets. That will help financial reporting. It'll help financial stability and will actually lead to stability in the markets. So it's easier to do business. Your work is recognized internationally. You know, one of the great things about IFRS that I really enjoyed is watching young kids qualify as accountants in Australia, in Canada, in America, not in America, in the UK, and they can go anywhere. They know the accounting. They don't have to relearn it. And that's what we want for you too. I feel very strongly about professionalism. When I was president of the Scottish Accountants, I was taken to a cemetery in Glasgow, and there was a gravestone, something I've never quite seen like it before. John McIntyre, Chartered Accountant. I've never seen it before or since, and you started to think, well, why is CA on that gravestone? And when you thought about it, who put it there? Did John ask for it to be there? Did his family think it had to be there because that was him? But it's what made John. It was his DNA. 24/7. He was a professional accountant and proud of it. And that's what it's all about. Working in the public interest, strong ethics, and ensuring you do a good job for your clients. Not pandering to them, but doing a good job for your clients. And that's part of the problem. Accountants have a similar problem, but not quite as marked as the valuation profession, because there's cowboys out there. And what we have to do is to make sure we identify the real professionals. And one of the things we've been talking about is, can we come up with an international credential which would be given by the individual institutes? But what it would show is a member of this institute is in an institute that's cleared all the hurdles, entry requirements, competence, CPE, and so on. These are the true professionals. And to identify you and distinguish you from the others. Well, where can we go to get what I hope is the ideal? We want you to have this global reach. One set of standards. Whatever it is, the gold standard, the highest we can get. We want you to have a place among the international professions. I represented accounting at the Financial Stability Board. I mentioned earlier, you're at the tough end. I would like to see valuation there too. And that's why we have to make it a clear, respected profession that the regulators jump to, turn to, and trust. And that's why it's so important. I would like to see, before too long, a requirement by the accounting standard setters when you're dealing with valuations which, as I said, are increasing more and more in accounting, you have to use IVS. But that would also mean if we have one set of standards, using your standards, because they're everybody's standards who matter. And that's when you're going to be a global profession. When you're recognized by the regulators as global, when people fully accept your status, which should be there, as a trusted, respected profession working in the public interest. Well, that's been a bit of a sermon. I'm always wary about sermons. They can go on endlessly. I remember being in the church not long ago in Scotland where the minister was banging on, and the old lady in front of me turned to a neighbour and said, "Is the minister no finished yet?" And back came the answer, "Aye, he's finished, he just can't stop." Well, let me show you, we can. I'm often asked, will we win? And as an accounting standard setter, I'd give the same answer I'd give now. I never liken standard setting to winning. I always liken it more to the cross-eyed Olympic javelin thrower. He didn't win any medals, but by God, he kept the crowd on the edge of their seats. And that's probably the best we can do. But actually, I do think we're going to win. There's a lot of support from the senior members of this profession. You deserve to have your place with the rest. You've got a tough job, and it's only now people are starting to recognize it. Good luck. May you all prosper.